Some of you might remember Bernie Madoff. He pulled off one of the biggest Ponzi schemes of all time, $65 billion worth. I've got a friend who knows him, knows the family, said they're wonderful people, some of the nicest people you'd ever hope to meet. People just threw money at him. He'd come up with this scheme. He had two businesses. One, he was buying and selling penny stocks, had a brokerage firm going on. The other was an investment company. And he fabricated all kinds of returns for people. He'd watch the stock markets, he'd watch the trends, he'd watch the highs, he'd watch the low, and he just fabricated reports of when he bought low and he sold high. Again, he'd send out the regular reports all the time. These people were so excited. They're watching their earnings grow at monumentally good records. They were so happy. They were so overjoyed. They thought they had so much money. And in 1990, his two sons turned him in to the feds for having a Ponzi scheme. And they came in and they started investigating. He admitted it'd been going on since 1990. With a little bit further research, they realized it went all the way back to the 70s. That $65 billion had just kind of vanished from everybody's accounts. It was what they really invested, and all the earnings since they had been with him, it just went away. He ripped off thousands of people. He looked so good, so wonderful. He was generous. He gave to churches, he gave to charities, he gave to both sides of the political parties. He was constantly giving a lot away of other people's money. He looked so good, but it all came down hard. It did not end well for him. His two boys that turned him in, Mark, eventually hung himself. Andrew died not too long after that of lymphoma. His brother Peter, that had run the operations for him, went to jail for 10 years, and he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. He lived 12 more years and he died in disgrace and shame. It did not go well. What we're looking at today in Scripture is hypocrisy. And we don't like to look at that, but I think all of us have a little bit of hypocrisy about different things. And the reason we're looking at this, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 6. We're going to do one verse today. That's really all we're going to cover. We're going to look at some others, but in this one verse, what we see is hypocrisy causes us to forfeit the rewards of God. I don't want you to miss any of the rewards of God. God would like you when you're not a hypocrite, when you follow him, when you serve him in humility. He would like to give you freedom. He would like to give you grace. He would like to increase your authenticity. And he would like for you to have a really tight relationship with Jesus. But hypocrisy will cause you to lose those rewards from God. So Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. Beware of the practicing of your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. We're just going to look at that one verse of Scripture today. Now, after this Scripture, it stays on this same theme. It talks about your acts of righteousness. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about acts of righteousness, like giving to the poor, like praying and fasting. So we're going to cover some interesting territory here. We're going to talk about giving. I love talking about money. I'm one of the few people that is so blessed that I don't have to pay for the building. I don't have to pay for the electricity. I don't have to get money. I don't have to get you to volunteer for anything. We are so blessed, so I can freely talk about money because you know at the end of the service, we're not going to pass the plate. I'm not going to be asking you for anything, which makes it easy. Most people don't like church because they're always talking about money. There's a lot to learn about money when we learn about three different ways God tells us to give and the blessings, the rewards that come. It's huge. But even if we give away money, but we do it for the wrong reasons, we miss the reward from God. I don't want you to miss that. Let's go back to this passage of scripture. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people. Stop right there. Beware. Beware. Watch out. Be careful. Take heed. Don't step in that hole. Don't fall into that trap. Beware. There is real danger if you practice your acts of righteousness just so you can be seen by other people. And guys, we've been conditioned all our lives to be seen by other people. Appearances are very, very, very important in this country. We can thank Mattel for Ken and Barbie that tell us how we should look. And when we look that way, everybody wants to look at us. And we like that. We need that. We're going to talk about why we have this huge need for attention, for the approval of other people. We're going to look at that. But it says, watch out. This is a big deal. Beware. Take this very seriously. For your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. This word seen in the Greek language, the Greek word, I won't even try to pronounce it, but it starts out with the letters T-H-E-A. That's where we get our word theater. Why do you go to the theater? To see the actors who are on stage. This word is loaded with meaning. If you do this as if you're on stage and you're acting and you want to be seen and you want the applause of the audience, that's where you get in so much trouble and you miss the rewards of God. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Where's God? In heaven. Where's heaven? Luke 17:21. And this is a leap for most of us. We've always kind of been conditioned to think heaven's up there, hell's below. Now that goes back to the earth is flat, heaven's above, hell's below. And our parents would say, don't wander away from mommy and daddy, you'll fall off the earth. Well, we know that's probably not true. There's some people still think the earth's flat. They might be right. They say they can prove it mathematically. It looks round to me, but you get to pick and choose. That's not the thing about this Bible study. I'll tell you options. You get to pick and choose what you believe. So we look at this, that reward in heaven, Luke 17:21, the kingdom of heaven is within you. The kingdom of heaven is defined as righteousness. We started talking about it. Don't do your acts of righteousness to be seen by people. It's righteousness, peace, and joy. Those are rewards in heaven. However, since heaven is within you, you become a magnet when you're living and you're in the kingdom of righteousness and peace and joy. You become a magnet for outer things. Jesus, through this whole Sermon on the Mount, is trying to help us understand God's level of righteousness. God set the bar. He gave us the 10 Commandments. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders kept lowering the bar, lower and lower and lower, till they got it lowered to the place where they said, okay, I can do that. I can keep the rules as I define them. And they thought, hey, I'm doing great. I've never murdered anybody. I'm so good. Pat themselves on the back. I'm doing great. I've never committed adultery. I'm doing so good. They can hate everybody. They can lust after everybody, but they're thinking, no, 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 no. It's all about the rules and the law rather than the relationship and the love. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is bringing a major correction that said, hey, You've the bar is too low. That is not God's standard. You brought it down to man's standard, which you can do in your own power. God set the bar up here. You cannot reach the bar without the help of God. You have to rely on Him. That is countercultural. We were raised to be independent, to do everything ourselves. And He's saying, no, I'm asking you to do things you cannot do in your own power. You're going to have to let God live His life through you. You got to decrease, He's got to increase. He makes it possible for us to do that. So we look at these things. He tells us about this. We're going to jump over to chapter 23. This is where Jesus really tells us what He thinks about hypocrisy. Before I read this, once upon a time, a hypocrite was a good thing. A hypocrite was somebody at the theater who wore a mask and entertained people. And you might have somebody come in from this side of the stage. You might have a one-person show, but they didn't have electricity. They didn't have YouTube. They didn't have movies. So they entertained themselves by going to watch live theater. And the actor would come in, and he's holding a mask over his face, and he might make you laugh. And he'll exit. He runs around backstage, comes in from the other side. He's got a different mask on. Same guy, different mask. Now he makes you cry. And then he comes back and he may come in from behind me and he comes in with yet another mask. And so a hypocrite was somebody who wore a mask. They wore it to be seen by people. They were the entertainers. They wanted to be seen by people. So it hasn't always been a bad word, but a hypocrite is somebody who is not what they appear to be. What you see on the outside does not represent what's on the inside. This is where Jesus has so much trouble with these people. So we read from Matthew 23. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. Ever wonder where that saying comes from? People should practice what they preach. Right there in the Bible. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. This is what Jesus is so upset about. They did it for the reward of man. They did it to be seen. They did it to look good, but they were not good. For they make, we'll skip over that part. Let's go down to verse 11. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Verse 26, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Verse 29, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You getting the point here? Jesus doesn't like hypocrisy. So we're going to look at four different rewards that we can lose if we're hypocrites. One of those rewards that we can lose, one of the first ones we're going to look at is freedom. In John chapter 8, verse 31 and 32. Because I think all of us like freedom. I'm politically disturbed these days because I'm watching my freedoms erode. I didn't like 9/11 at all because we created Homeland Security and the TSA. Once upon a time, it was easier to fly. Now you got to go through TSA. You got to go through it. We're losing our freedoms. I don't like that. I like freedom. Jesus tells us the source of freedom. John 8:31 and 32. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So many times people live a lie and they don't understand how they're conflicting themselves. Let's talk about a human being for a moment. You are a spirit. The verbs are important. You are a spirit. You've been in the mind of God since before forever. Before there was time and space, you were in the mind of God. That's based on the presupposition that God knows everything, always has known everything, always will know everything. He knows everything. He's outside, he's bigger than time and space. So, truth is important to your spirit. Your spirit, you are a spirit, you have a soul, you live in a body for a relatively very short period of time. Let's talk about this. Your spirit has three functions. It's your conscience, which tells you what's right and wrong. It's your communion with God, which tells you what's true and not true. It's your intuition. Intuition is when you know things that do not necessarily come to you through your five senses. When we do prophetic ministry, total strangers walk in here. I've never seen them before. I don't know anything about them, and yet God will give us words for them that sometimes are right on target. That's intuition. It's not coming from anything I see or hear or taste or touch or feel. It comes from our spirits. So if you've got a spirit that loves truth and knows truth, but you got a soul that's a little bit hypocritical, it's phony. It's not the real deal. It lacks authenticity. It's not genuine. Your soul is your mind, your will, and your emotions. And sometimes it just feels good to tell a big whopping lie. We make ourselves feel better. We'll just tell some tall tale. We caught an 8-inch fish, but by the time we tell our friends about it, it was 18 inches, and I think I'm going to have it framed. It was just so beautiful. It was so big. It took me 10 minutes to get it in the boat. Well, it was like 10 seconds to get it in the boat. But we embellish things, and embellishment breeds embellishment. And tall tales get bigger and bigger and bigger. And after a while, if we've lied enough, we don't know what truth is anymore in our mind, our wills, and our emotions. So we're conflicted if our soul is hypocritical because our spirit is based on truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. All those people who were following and throwing money at Bernie Madoff didn't know the truth. They thought his investment company was real. They thought they were becoming wealthy. They thought their investments were growing so fast, they had to sell other things and put it in with him too. They were going overboard. You've heard that it's fear and greed that drive the markets. I've been victim of that on many cases. Fear and greed are real, but they're not based on truth. And so we conflicted. The second reward we can lose from God if we're hypocrites is grace. Grace is so important. In James 4:6, this is a passage that shows up 3 different places in Scripture. I'm reading this one. Originally, it was in the Old Testament. It says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. If you don't take anything home with you today, take this home with you. Man's humility activates the grace of God. If we went back to the Old Testament, looked at this in the Hebrew language, that word for oppose is a word picture. Hebrew, Chinese, Eastern languages, they're pictorial. Western languages are phonetic. I hated Hebrew in seminary. I nearly failed, but I couldn't stand to repeat the course, and I had to have it. So I hired a tutor just to get me through it. And then I cheated. It was so hard. And I figured out the professor was not teaching it correctly. He was teaching it to us phonetically. And he was one of the biggest Hebrew scholars in the whole Southern Baptist Convention. A delightful, wonderful man, very intelligent, but he had learned Hebrew from non-Hebrew people, and he hadn't learned it correctly. A Hebrew word is pictures put together. Every letter in the language is a picture. This is a picture of somebody dressed in full battle armament. When we are proud, God says to Satan and the demons, nah, let him go. This one's mine. I'm going to deal with him. God opposes the proud. I have gone toe to toe many times with God. Didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I can tell you this: I never, ever won, nor will I. But God gives grace to the humble. So let's think about humility. What does it mean to be humble? What does that look like? Let me start you out with some dictionary definitions of humble. Humility is the quality of not being proud because you are aware of your bad characteristics. Another definition: humility is the feeling or attitude that you have no special importance that makes you better than others. Humility is a lack of pride. For our purposes, I like to define humility in a functional way, that humility is seeing yourself the way God sees you. We got to go to Moses. He's our poster boy. Moses was the meekest, most humble man in all the land. That's what he was. He was the most. Now, watch him. When God finds him, he's been in hiding for 40 years. First 40 years, he gets the best education on the planet in the Pharaoh's house in the Egyptian dynasty. He's very well educated. He kills an Egyptian. He's got to go hide on the backside of the wilderness. He's lived in obscurity for the last 40 years. God shows up at the burning bush, and they have a conversation. And Moses has a couple of questions for him. Who are you? I am that I am. God answered him. Then he had questions. Who am I? Why would you be talking to me? Who am I? And they had a little conversation. And because Moses was humble, he saw himself the way God saw him, with his strengths, with his weaknesses, with his successes, with his failures. Most of us don't look at ourselves the way God looks at us. He looks at us holistically. He sees all of our sin, and he sees that we're created in his image. He sees that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. He sees that we were worth purchasing. We were worth adopting. He has brought us into his family. He's made us joint heirs with Jesus. He sees us trustworthy. I'd say most people, more than 50% of the people I know, don't really trust themselves. And you present a challenge to them, and because they don't trust themselves, because they don't see themselves the way God sees them, they miss a lot of their potential. This week, I was in touch with two different people. One of them is about 23, 24 years old. I would say he is a young superstar. He's in a very elite invitation only master's program. He was trading a few weeks ago. He made 68% in 2 weeks. I wish I could get him to invest some of my money for him. This is a kid, and he's good looking. He's exceedingly well mannered. He's moral. He's ethical, from a great home. And yet he doesn't see himself the way God sees him. He feels insecure. He has low self esteem. It's not based on facts. He's a little superstar. Got another friend, somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. I think he's one of the sharpest guys I know. And yet he constantly puts himself down when I listen to him. He doesn't see what a spectacular being is. He's good looking, he's wealthy, he's educating, perfect manners, just a renaissance man, so gifted, so talented, but he doesn't see himself the way God sees him. I define humility as seeing yourself the way God sees you. And if God calls you to do something, you think, God, I got about 5% of what I need to get that job done. But if you're like Moses and you're keenly aware of what's wrong with you, he was a felon, he was on the run, he was a fugitive, he'd been out of society for 40 years. If he walked into Pharaoh's house, by law, they could execute him on the site. There was a price on his head. But if God told him to do something, he realized, gosh, if God thinks I can do it, I better get in agreement with him. Do you realize that even if you're inadequate and God has put something in your heart to do? I wish we had more time. Yesterday, I looked at an article of 10 people that were total, complete failures and worthless from all practical standpoints until they were well past 30 years old. And then they became some of the best known names on the planet today. If you see yourself the way God sees you, you're going to see a whole lot of really, really good things about yourself. So man's humility, man seeing himself the way God sees him, brings grace. Your humility will activate the grace of God. Why do you need grace? Well, it's your blessing at God's expense. It's a free gift. It's a free pass. It's a do-over. We all need grace. I tell you, when I learned a big lesson about this, many years ago, I was on staff at Lake Point Baptist Church. I was the lowly part-time youth minister, half salary, only working 45 hours a week. That was part-time in church work. Going to seminary, taking 15 hours, spending 30 hours a week in the library, 10 hours with the carpool, going all the way to Fort Worth for classes. So it was about a 90 to 95-hour work week for 3.5 years. Well, I had suggested to the pastor that a good way to do staff meetings had been something I'd experienced with the best manager I ever had in my life. He said, we're going to meet together for 30 minutes once a week. I'm going to let you run your job. I'm going to stay out of your business. But every week in this meeting, we're going to talk about what you did last week and what you're going to do next week. And when you come back next week, I'm going to ask you, did you do everything you told me you were going to do last week? And we'll plan together the next week. He said, I will not interfere. I will not intervene, and you will never surprise me. I want to know exactly what's going on. I want to know if you're having trouble. I will let you handle it. If you need my help, ask me for it. I will step in. I only asked him to step in once in 3 months while I was a summer staffer there. And boy, he fixed the problem about that fast. He was a powerful individual. It was amazing, but he let me run my own show with accountability. So I'm in staff meeting. We're going around the room. Leadership staff of the church is there. We're talking about what we were supposed to do last week and if we did it or not. Well, I had about 4 things to do that week. I got 3 of them done. Didn't get the 4th one done. Just ran out of time. And I just happened to be defensive. So when the senior pastor asked me about it, I told him what I did, came to that fourth thing and said, I didn't get to it. And he questioned that. Well, I got defensive. We had some words. It was not pretty. Of course, I lost. He was the senior pastor. I was the part time youth minister. And it was just a bad feeling. It was a bad scene. About 3, 4 weeks later, we're back in staff meeting. I decided to humble myself. And rather than making excuses and hiding it and fighting back, I thought, I'm just going to humble myself. And I started out with, I got 4 things done. There was a fifth. I am so sorry. I owe all of you apology. I dropped the ball. I failed to get it done. But my plan is I'll have it done before 5 o'clock today. I'm so sorry. Totally different senior pastor. He said, man, don't worry about it. Is there anything we can do to help you get it done? Could she do this for you? Could he do that for you? Can I do this for you? It was it was grace. I missed the reward of grace the first time around. It went poorly. But when I humbled myself, God gave me grace. And I think they felt bad for me. They weren't out to get me. They felt sorry. They identified. They were sympathetic. They were empathetic. So don't miss the reward of grace. The Pharisees were missing that. Why? Because they were not humble. They were hypocrites. They were trying to hide behind the lies that they had created. Next thing we look at is authenticity. Don't want you to miss the blessings of authenticity. This is what Jesus says to these guys. He says a lot in Matthew 23 about being authentic, and they were not authentic. Now, here's humility in chapter 23, verse 11. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And then he starts into, but woe to you. He goes on. We get down to verse 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness, so that you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Let's talk about authenticity. Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about authenticity often. I watched a short video this week. It was probably from a year or two ago, but he's talking about authenticity. He's talking about being willing, having the courage to face the suffering and the malevolence that's in this world, to face the bad things. He said, if you're married, you can keep everything light and easy and never even really get to know each other. He said, but if you'll go into honest truth with each other, and you'll say, when I married you, these were my expectations. These were my desires. I'm disappointed. I don't feel like I'm getting what I signed up for. Those are going to be difficult conversations. It's good to remember Ephesians 4, always speaking the truth in love. If you go to these places, it's best that you're not yelling and screaming and using profanity, but they're hard conversations. And in life, when we face the tough things, he says, 2 things happen. He said, if you're willing to suffer, if you're willing to put yourself in positions that might be more than you could handle without God's help, and you face malevolence, people who are out to get you, and you endure that, the 2 things that are going to happen is, one, those difficult situations do contain information. So if you make it through the difficult situations in life, you come out informed. He said the next thing that happens, and there's some really good scientific research, is when you're under emotional stress in situations, it unlocks some of your genes. Genes are binary, they're either on or they're off. And you got your genes from your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents. He says when you're under stress and you stay in it, that stress is going to unlock genes and you're going to unlock some ancient wisdom from your ancestors. You know, things are passed on. 3 times in Scripture it says, the iniquities of the fathers will be visited on the second and third and fourth generations. The third and fourth generations, that's what it says. But the blessings of the Lord endure for 1,000 generations. So when God starts unlocking those things, you know, we've had Bible studies on those passages that talk about the blessings of persecution and tribulation. Good things, God brings good things out of those. He said most people have no idea what an efficient person can do. And most people don't care about being efficient. They don't care about being the best they can be. They're not working on self-improvement. Most people go through life, they may do harm, they may do good. He said, just imagine what the world would be like if people just shifted from trying to do harm to trying to do good. Just imagine what would happen with people. Most people think, I don't really matter. My life's not that important. I don't have much influence. He said, everybody today has at least 1,000 relationships in the course of their life. You just add them up. People you worked with, people you went to school with, easily, quickly will come up to at least 1,000 relationships. He said, well, you've got a relationship with 1,000 people. You will, somewhere along the way, influence them. You may be negative, you might be close to neutral, you might be positive, but it's going to influence 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people all have 1,000 relationships. Now, you've gone from that 1,000 people to the next 1,000, so you're one short of 1,000,000. And then if it goes on to the next generation, you know 1,000 people, they know 1,000 people, they know 1,000 people, you're up to 1,000,000,000. It must have been a couple years ago because he said the population of the planet is now at 7 billion people. I looked yesterday, we have topped 8 billion people. He said it's going to go to 9 and then it's going to drop abruptly. Now, I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know why that's going to happen, but I guarantee you, if you ask Dr. Jordan Peterson why, he will give you a very detailed reason for why he believes that. But you have such impact. And if you're an authentic person, it's going to increase your impact so much. Because if you're authentic, if you're the same on the outside as the inside, people are going to trust you. They're going to feel you. They're going to know you're authentic, you're genuine, you're the real deal. And they will respect you. Those are rewards that come from God. So it's important to develop our authenticity. Now we look at these poor scribes and Pharisees. They did everything to be seen by people. What were they looking for? What did they need? We live on energy. We cannot live without energy. How do we get it? Well, we eat food. If you eat something today, it's going to be probably in a plate or a bowl, might even be something you drink, but it's matter. And as you take that matter into your body, you convert it to energy. See, right now, as I stand here, I'm matter. That's matter. That's a real body. It's 99% empty space, but we call it matter. You speed it up a little bit, it becomes energy. You speed it up a little bit more, it becomes light. You speed it up a little bit more, I'm going to say, and I think science will prove this someday, I cannot prove it to you today. I think if something goes faster than the speed of light, it doesn't cease to exist, but it will convert back to consciousness. And as we're speaking right now, you are thinking. Every cell in your body is giving off photons. You literally are beings of light. You're giving off heat. That's energy. And you have a body. That's matter. And we're in a constant situation of flux. But we can't survive without energy any more than we can survive without oxygen or food. So we get energy from food, we get energy from other people. They wanted the energy from other people. They probably didn't understand if they would spend time with God, they could get energy from God. You can't outgive God. You give God some attention, He's going to give you more. Right now, He's aware of everything you're doing 24/7. That's a lot of attention, and it's God's energy. Energy follows attention. Whatever you give your energy to, your attention to, you give your energy to. Whatever you give your energy to expands. So the Pharisees found a way, if they dressed up in their robes and wore their phylacteries on their foreheads and on their arms, and they acted really holy, people would see them coming. It's like, ooh, step back. There's a Pharisee. There's somebody important here. And in the synagogues, and when the Pharisees sat down to teach, people would flock around. They got a lot of attention from people. James Redfield, in his book, The Celestine Prophecy, 20 or 30 years ago, talked about 4 strategies we need to watch out for. Because there are psychic vampires out there who would love to take your attention, whether you would like to give it to them or not. And they have these 4 strategies. He says there's the person that's for me. You know, my parents didn't want me. They put me in an orphanage when I was little. I married somebody who was abusive. Now we're separated, don't have anything to do with them. My children won't talk to me because they love their daddy. I'm just having such a tough time. My dog bit me the other day. I mean, everything's going wrong. And you know, you probably don't care about me either. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. How did I get lumped? They got you. You don't want to be the bad guy who hurts them even more. So they got your attention. They're people who are aloof. You ever run into people and you're trying to have a dialogue with them, a conversation? It's like, hey, how you been? Great. What you been up to? Bunch of things. Well, where you been? All over the place. Who you been hanging out with? Bunch of people. You know, you just didn't get anything substantive at all. And they got you just by being aloof. You'd like to know a little bit more and they just won't give it to you. So they got you. Then there are people who are interrogators. Do you know those people that every time you see them, they just start asking you questions? I mean, they are all up in your business, question, question, question. They just interrogate you, and they're getting your attention. Then there are intimidators. Those are the people that you're afraid to turn your back on because you never know what they'll do. I once had a close friend that I find to be extremely dishonest. And I severed the relationship. I broke fellowship with him because he just lied too much. I didn't know he was lying in the beginning. And we were in the same church. And I started sitting in different places. If I didn't have anybody behind me, he might come up, put his hands on my shoulders, and lean over and just whisper in my ear and tell me how much he loves me and appreciates me. Or if I sit on the aisle, we might be in worship. He comes up, puts his hands on me from behind, says something to me. Still trying to maintain the relationship. I started sitting in the middle of the pew in front of people so he couldn't get to me from either side or from behind me. Why? He was an intimidator. I've added a 5th category. I call it radar lock. Do you know anybody that when they come up and they start talking, they won't stop? I mean, they're not there to have a conversation. They just want somebody to listen to them, give them attention, and they'll start talking. They don't have to breathe. They don't have to swallow. I've seen people go 10, 15, 20 minutes nonstop. They've caught me a couple of times. I'm talking about real live human beings that can talk 15 or 20 minutes without any regard whether I'd like to participate in the conversation or not. And finally, it's like, I am so sorry, but I've got an appointment. I've got to end this conversation, pack my stuff up, and go. They just get you in radar lock, and they need it. God gives us better ways to get attention. Last week, we talked about Micah 6:8. It says, what does God require of you, oh man, but to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. The fourth reward you can lose because of hypocrisy is a bonded relationship with Jesus. I don't want you to miss the reward of freedom or grace or authenticity or a bonded relationship with Jesus. I'm going to wrap it up with a story about Dr. Chuck Swindoll. He is 89 years old. He's still the senior pastor of Stonebriar Community Church in Frisco. He preaches all the time. He's one of the most successful Christians I've ever seen in my life. Why would I call him successful? He's got more than 70 best-selling Christian books out there, and they're still good. I still refer back to them that might have been written 30 or 40 years ago. They're really, really good books, and they're still relevant because they were based on timeless truths of the Bible. He speaks to millions of people, has for decades on the radio, his radio show, Insight for Living. And he had a megachurch in California that was thriving. It was growing and growing and growing, and he left there to come to Dallas, Texas, to be the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. When he got here as president of seminary, which is no small job, he started a little church in Frisco. And the first year he opened his doors, he had 2,000 people come in every Sunday, and it has grown since then. How do you become that successful? What do you do to still be working full time at a very big job when you're 89 years old? He's got the blessings of God. He's got the rewards of God. How did he get it? I think a defining moment for him was many years ago when I heard him tell the story. He was a pastor in a small church. It was his first church when he was a full-time senior pastor. Well, you know, if you're in your first church and it splits and it dies, you're pretty much done in ministry. Word will get out. You might not get a second chance if you kill a church. Well, he was in this church. When he went there, there were already factions. There were 7 elders. He became the 7th. There were 3 elders that had some preference on some issue over here. The other 3 elders were over here. I don't know what the issue was, but it's the kind of issue they were coming up for a vote, and he knew this could split the church. And he knew that all the elders and all the people knew that he was casting the deciding vote. He talked to his wife, Cynthia. He said, I have to hear from God on this. I don't know what to do. I could kill the church. I could cause so much harm. I've got to hear from God. I'm going to leave. I'm going to take my Bible. I'm going to pray and fast. I'm not coming home until I hear from God. If I stay in a hotel, I'll call. I'll let you know where I am, but I have to hear from God. Got in his car, started driving. Volkswagen Beetle. He's driving up the highway. It's fairly straight. There's not a whole lot of traffic. Pulls his Bible out. He's praying. Starts to read his Bible while he's driving his car 60 miles an hour. He's got it on the steering wheel. Starts in Galatians. Reads down to Galatians 1:10, desperately looking for God to give him some guidance and instruction. He comes to Galatians 1:10. He reads it. He thinks, wow, this could be my answer. He looks at it again, reads it again, pulls over on the side of the road, reads it out loud. And he said, for the rest of my life, I'm going to serve an audience of one. It said, the Apostle Paul, am I still seeking the approval of man or of God? If I'm still seeking the approval of man, I cannot be a bond servant of Christ. Bond servants back in those days were slaves that had chosen to stay with their masters. Even though they could be given freedom, their masters were good and they wanted to be there. When we make ourselves a bondservant of Christ, you realize nobody loves you more than God. Nobody has the capacity to love you more than God. God is not fickle. God is not moody. You know how people are. If you need people's approval, sometimes no matter what you do, how good you are, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have their approval. And have you ever noticed how people want different things from you at the same time? You may have two children. One of them's got to go swimming today. The other one's got to go to Six Flags today. And if you have that need to have both of their approval, you may lose every time because they want totally different things going in totally different directions. But with God, if you choose to serve an audience of one, your life gets so much more simple. Not your spouse, not your children, not your boss, nobody. When the question comes down to God, what would you have me do and say and think and feel in this situation? Life gets so much simpler. I think that's why Chuck Swindoll has been so incredibly successful. He served an audience of one, the sovereign, all knowing, all powerful, ever present, sovereign God. We have that opportunity. Hypocrisy will cause you to miss the rewards of freedom, of grace, of authenticity, and of being a bond servant for Christ. That's why Jesus was so against hypocrisy.